after that, let's go ahead and get into our program for today. And so this year's the 80th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which signaled the U.S. entrance into World War II. And we thought it would be a good idea we needed to commemorate that, to acknowledge that anniversary. And we wanted to combine it with Sioux City, so that it wasn't just about the big picture of Pearl Harbor. And so I have combined the story of Pearl Harbor and World War II with how World War II transformed Sioux City during the war years. And so we'll kind of flip back and forth between the world scene and what was going on here in Sioux City. So first off, let's have a little refresher about how World War II had its beginnings and how the U.S. became involved. So it helps for me to kind of tick off a few little factoids that I'm going to throw at you to kind of get an understanding of how this unfolded. First off, the World War II really centers on Germany and Europe and Japan and Asia. And Germany and Japan have, among other things, they have geographic issues in terms of they have geographic vulnerabilities, and those played a role in especially Germany's role in both world wars. And when we look at Germany, the big issue for Germany is, first off, it's the biggest economy in Europe. When Germany was united in the 1870s, it became an economic superpower, very quickly developed into a military superpower. But the problem for Germany is it's surrounded by France in the west and Russia to the east, and there's really no natural barrier to invasion to Germany because especially the northern part is the North European plain that extends way into Russia. And it's basically land very similar to Iowa. And over the centuries, many marauding armies have traipsed across that land. And so Germany was inherently insecure that way. And so it always sought to try to expand the area around it to give itself space to defend itself. And so that was a part of why Germany kind of played an instigating role in both world wars. So first off, World War II begins with the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939. Poland was allied with Great Britain and with France, brought them into the war, but they couldn't help Poland, so Poland was overrun in a month. And at that point, Germany had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and so the Soviet Union remained neutral during this time. So the U.S. had its own issues with this. So after the experience in World War I, there was just a really strong isolationist sentiment in the United States, particularly in the American Midwest. A lot of people viewed U.S. participation in the sacrifices that were made in World War I as a mistake, and they didn't want it. Many people didn't want to repeat that. And so in Congress, there was a very strong isolationist bloc that really, for years, delayed American action in terms of getting involved in World War II. And so the outbreak of the war in Europe did not bring the United States directly into the war. What it did happen was after Germany conquered France in June of 1940, the first action the U.S. made was a deal with Great Britain, in which the U.S. gave Great Britain about 50 destroyers and in return for bases in the Western Hemisphere. So that was the first thing. And then in September of 1940, the U.S. enacted the first draft, peacetime draft in American history. And so at that point, men were being brought into the U.S. Armed Forces, and there was a buildup in the eventuality that the U.S. would have to get involved. The next thing was in early 1941, in March of 1941, the U.S. Congress passed the Lend Lease Act. And Lend Lease was basically providing material support to Great Britain and eventually to the Soviet Union and to China in Asia in their efforts against Germany and Japan. So the U.S. was indirectly involved at that point. So the situation really began to turn in June of 1941 when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. And then in October of 1941, the U.S. extended Lend Lease aid to the Soviet Union. So that's the situation in Europe. And fairly soon after the outbreak of war in Europe, the U.S. military started to make preparations. And so here we have a picture that was taken right out of Sioux City City Hall building at 6th and Douglas Streets, right next to the federal building, these guys. And what we had were Army recruiters from Fort Des Moines coming to Sioux City and recruiting men from Sioux City into the Army. And so we have them lined up here in the foreground. And so that was starting to happen even here in Sioux City. Now, in early 1941, the U.S. or the Iowa National Guard was activated. And so here we have some companies from Lamar and Sioux City of the 133rd Iowa Infantry doing some drilling at what was the Sioux City Armory building over on Pearl Street, which is the Boys and Girls Club today. And so that's where they're at. And then probably the highest ranking officer from Sioux City during World War II was General Gordon Holler, he served on Sioux City City Council. He was a businessman here in Sioux City, but he had been in the Iowa National Guard since the early 1900s. And during World War II, he was in charge of the U.S. military police in the European theater. So he was a pretty high-ranking figure. Here we have a picture, so same time, so the Iowa National Guard was activated in February of 1941, and they were sent to Louisiana for training, and so these are pictures of the families and of the guardsmen that were getting on the trains along 2nd Street to go to Louisiana at that time. All right, in Japan, things were progressing in a different way. So in Japan, or in Asia, Japan had emerged from World War I greatly strengthened. So Japan had rapidly industrialized in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it had become a significant power by the 1920s or so. But the problem for Japan, instead of being geographically vulnerable like Germany, the big problem for Japan was, even though it had a very advanced industrial economy, Japan has very little in terms of natural resources, like oil, coal, iron ore, things like that are needed in heavy industry. And so Japan depended on trade routes to the mainland of Asia, and particularly to the south down to the Indonesian islands where there was oil available. And so that was very important to Japan. Now, in addition to Japan, the main other powers in the Western Pacific in the early 1940s were the United States and Great Britain. And so there was kind of a three-way pull for influence in this area. And remember, at this time, the Philippines were a colony of the United States, had been since the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. So the U.S. had a formal military presence in the Philippines. And, of course, that's right along the trade route that Japan depended on for the oil from Indonesia. So Japan had been taking more and more aggressive moves in the Western Pacific since the early 1930s. In 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria and set up a colony. So this is northern China, northeastern China, and set up a colony they called Manchukuo. They also controlled the Korean Peninsula, and so they were really heavily in East Asia. In June of 1940, they occupied French Indochina, which was a French colony that today is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, in that area. And the reason they occupied that was to control the trade routes to Indonesia. Well, the U.S. was becoming more and more nervous about the things that the Japanese were doing. And so in July of 1940, the U.S. halted exports of certain things that the Japanese economy and military depended on, like airplanes, parts, different aviation fuel, scrap iron, all those kinds of things that it needed, because the U.S. was a major trade partner with Japan. And then since Japan had been at war first in Manchuria and then since 1937 in China proper, in April of 1941, as the Japanese got more aggressive in East Asia, Lend Lease aid from the United States was extended to China. Now, when southern Indochina was formally occupied by the Japanese in July of 1941, that's when the U.S. really became alarmed about what was going on in Asia. And at that point, the U.S. halted exports of really important commodities like oil, gasoline, and also froze Japanese assets in U.S. banks. And so that's when it really got serious, because most of Japan's oil at that point was coming from the United States. And so that was potentially crippling to the Japanese. And this is what led directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the situation in Japan was such that there were those that wanted to come to some kind of understanding with the United States, and then there were those that thought it was better to have a confrontation with the United States sooner rather than later. And the latter view won out when General Hideki Tojo became Japanese Prime Minister in October of 1941, and he was a strong advocate of confrontation with the United States, that it was going to be harder to deal with the United States the longer that Japan put it off. And so the attack on Pearl Harbor, which had been in planning for about a year by the fall of 1941, was authorized by the Japanese Emperor Hirohito on the 1st of December 1941, so just days before the attack itself. So now we have a picture of the situation in Pearl Harbor. So keep in mind, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was really the main U.S. Pacific naval base outside of the mainland of the United States at that time, and still remains so today. And so this is how Pearl Harbor was set up. And in this picture, so this is from October 1941, so just about 2 months before the attack, you can see a good portion of the U.S. fleet was in Pearl Harbor at that time, including most of the aircraft carriers, which are right along here, and then around the island that you see in the middle are a lot of the battleships and smaller ships like destroyers and cruisers and such. So there was a good portion of the U.S. power in the Pacific was there in Pearl Harbor, which is why Japan targeted that as a place to attack. So here's a picture taken from a Japanese plane, and so what the attack on Pearl Harbor was a heavy air raid on the naval base, which was launched from Japanese aircraft carriers. And of course, this was done without a declaration of war. It was a surprise attack, so even though the U.S. had intelligence, certainly, that something was in the offing, it was not formally declared. The surprise was really key to its success. And so it commenced at a little after 7:45 on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. And it just happened that at that time, the U.S. aircraft carriers weren't in port, but pretty much all of the battleships were. And so in this, you can see the big battleships around the central island here in Pearl Harbor, which would be really vulnerable during the attack. So here we have the battleship USS West Virginia, and it was sunk, although it was eventually raised and returned to service in July of 1944. But in its the damage that was caused to it, 106 crewmen were killed, including one of the casualties from the United States from Sioux City in the Pearl Harbor attack. That was George O'Hara Brantham. And here's a picture. So here's Brantham, and he was a molder in the U.S. Navy serving on the USS West Virginia. And this is a picture of his wife, Louise, and their daughter, Georgia Louise, who was 4 months old and I believe had not seen her father at that time, so never actually knew him. And so here's the battleship USS Oklahoma. It was capsized and was a total loss, killing over 400 servicemen. And you could see the Oklahoma on its side here in this picture. Behind it is the USS Maryland, and then you can see the West Virginia that we saw earlier off here on the other side of the photo. And there were a couple of Sioux City men on the USS Oklahoma who lost their lives. One was Harry Ernest Nichols, who was a storekeeper on the Oklahoma. And then Wesley James Brown, who was from Odo, Iowa, and he was a fireman on the Oklahoma and was killed. And then the really devastating loss was the USS Arizona. And the Arizona was particularly bad in terms of casualties because a Japanese bomb actually hit the central magazine of the Oklahoma and really blew it to bits. And so in this picture, you could kind of get a sense of the damage. And so about half of all of the men that died in the Pearl Harbor attack died on the Arizona, over 1,100 dead, and that was a total loss. And there was one Sioux City resident on the Arizona who lost his life, Kenneth Leroy Bosley, who was an electrician's mate on the Arizona. So here's a picture during the attack, one of the big explosions. The whole attack lasted 90 minutes, an hour and a half time. In that time, 2,400 American servicemen and civilians were killed. Over 1,100 were wounded. 159 aircraft destroyed, 188 damaged. There were 8 battleships, 4 were sunk and 4 were damaged. 2 of them a total loss. And the other ships, 4 other ships were sunk, 9 were damaged, and one of those was a total loss. But as I said earlier, the big key to why the U.S. Navy was able to recover in the months afterwards was that the aircraft carriers were not in base, and so they were not damaged during the Pearl Harbor attack. So between the attack on Pearl Harbor and May of 1942, Japan was able to take control of pretty much all of the islands of the Western Pacific, and the U.S. Navy was not in a position to respond. And so here we have the situation by the summer of 1942, and in this map, basically this red line shows the area that was controlled by Japan going into the summer of 1942, and so but gradually then the U.S. began chipping away at that, and it first off halted Japanese expansion during the summer, and then started pushing the Japanese back. So we had the Pearl Harbor strike on December 7th, and then there were a couple of significant losses by the U.S. Navy in early 1942, but the first big victory was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, in which the U.S. Navy stopped the Japanese Navy from expanding southward, and basically at that point secured Australia from Japanese invasion. And then the other major victory for the U.S. came at Midway Island, a small island to the northwest of Hawaii, in which the U.S. Navy was able to stop Japanese expansion to the east. And so those lines, Japan never got farther in either of those directions for the rest of the war. And so those were very fortunate victories. And so at the end of the summer, in August of 1942, that's when the U.S. started its campaign in Asia that would last the rest of the war, what's sometimes called the island hopping campaign. It began at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands down in this area. And essentially, the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy worked island by island from the Solomon Islands into New Guinea, eventually into Borneo and up into the Philippines, and then also through some of the smaller islands outside of there, and working their way back to the Japanese home islands. And so in a general way, that's how the Pacific campaign went during World War II. So here's a picture of Sioux City in December of 1941, and so you can see so this is right after Pearl Harbor, and you can see Sioux City was decorated for the Christmas season, and so you can just kind of think of what was on people's minds at this time when you see this photo, this festive photo, but what had just happened. And this picture was taken on 4th Street between Jackson and Nebraska Streets, and we're looking to the west in this photograph, right outside our building today, even though our building wasn't there then. So once the U.S. was in the war, major changes started to happen in Sioux City really rapidly. And the first big thing to happen was the U.S. Army came in and took over what accounted for the Sioux City Municipal Airport. And keep in mind that the municipal airport had opened in 1940. It was very small. It had been a WPA project during the 1930s, and the Army took it over, and then 1,200 additional acres, and in a matter of months built a great big base to train bomber crews for the war in both the European theater and in the Pacific theater. And so it was an amazing thing. It's one of those amazing things that was done during the wartime emergency, where this tiny airport was turned into this huge training facility in which at any one time there were about 6,000 men at the Sioux City Army Air Base training, doing flight training. And it started out training crews in the B-24 Liberator bomber, which we'll see later. And then eventually, fairly quickly, in late 1942, early 1943, transitioned to the B-17 bomber. And in the way the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II worked, there were 3 stages of flight training, and Sioux City's Air Base provided the final stage before the crews were sent to the theaters of war. So this was their last stage of training. The most advanced training that they got was here at the Sioux City Army Air Base. So here's a picture of the air base in 1945. So of course, we have Sergeant Bluff right here. And so you can get a sense of the expansiveness. You have all the different barracks buildings and the different buildings that were necessary for the air base. And keep in mind, when it started out, I'm not sure what the very original portion was, but it would have been just a tiny corner of this overall facility was there when the Army took it over in early 1942. Here's a picture from the showing the tarmac down at the air base in 1944. And we have the weather tower. Great photo. There's all kinds of things happening. There's a guy checking out the weather tower, the instrumentation in this photo. And of course, you can see the mostly there's B-17s and in view here. So as I said, started out training crews in the consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, which was actually the most advanced bomber at the beginning of World War II that the U.S. had. And one famous person that was trained in the U.S. Or at the Sioux City Air Base for B-24s was the actor Jimmy Stewart, trained here in 1942 and flew B-24s in Europe during the war. The B-24 was used in both the European and Pacific theaters. It was particularly used in the Pacific theater because it had greater range than the B-17. It had a range of about 2,400 miles, where the B-17 was limited to about 1,600 miles. And so the B-17 wasn't used too much in the Pacific theater during World War II. It was mostly confined to the European theater. And so here's a B-17, a Boeing B-17 crew, also called the Flying Fortress. And as I said before, it was used in both theaters, but because its range was limited, it was not used too much in the Pacific theater, but it was the primary bomber in the European theater during the war. Now, crews in Europe preferred the B-17 overall. For one thing, it could fly higher. It could fly at about 35,000 feet, where the B-24 was limited to about 30,000, and so it was easier to avoid the anti-aircraft fire during daytime raids in the European theater. It was also considered to be the Flying Fortress. It was considered to be a more durable aircraft than the B-24. But the B-24 was used more in the Pacific because of its greater range. And so these crews usually had 9 or 10 men in a crew. You had a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and then you had several gunners that were on these planes. So they were big crews, and so if they went down, you had a potential of losing a lot of lives pretty quickly if there was an accident, or of course once they were in theater during combat. Here's a picture of a formation of B-17s over Sioux City. And this was just a constant sight during World War II in town, where these planes would be flying around. And they would a lot of times be flying at night, doing nighttime training, where they would do practice bombing runs. I think a lot of times they would go down toward Oklahoma and Texas and then come back, that kind of thing. And there were accidents. Although the base overall, the U.S. Army Air Corps considered the U.S. Army Air Base to have a good safety record, there were inevitably accidents because of just the sheer number of people that were being trained. And so here's a plane that crashed. I think this one was up near Orange City in 1944. And I don't think anyone died in this one. This was one that the crew survived. But for instance, here's one. There were a couple of crashes right in Sioux City. I wish I had an original photo. This is a newspaper photo, but this was out on the west side on South Judd Streets. And the plane, the B-17, crashed right between these two houses, but didn't hit the two houses. It didn't. All of the crewmen were killed in this crash. But no one, the families, no one in the neighborhood was killed, which is I just find amazing. The way this worked out. Now, for the first off, from early 1942 until at least mid 1944, civilians weren't allowed at the Army Air Base. It was all military personnel, and it was mostly men. You know, there were some women, of course, in the Army Air Corps, like the WACs, but for the most part, it was men and military personnel alone. For many years, even for instance, the Sioux City Journal and the local newspapers couldn't even take photos of the base. You know, it was a wartime policy. But beginning later in the war, beginning in 1944, mostly gradually civilian workers were brought in, and particularly women who increasingly took over the office duties and things that had to be done at the base that previously had been done by male airmen. So here we have a great picture of women down at the air base next to a B-17. Of course, there were all kinds of bond drives and rationing and things that were designed, first also, designed to raise money for the U.S. war effort, but also designed to get the U.S. public involved in the war in an important way through contributing money and also through undergoing things like rationing. It was a way that the U.S. public that wasn't serving in the military participated directly in the war effort. And so here we have a picture of a bond drive in which various state officials, the head of the Iowa National Guard and such, came to Sioux City and were raising money in a bond drive in January of 1942. And they're at the Mayfair Hotel at 3rd and Nebraska Streets in this photo. There are all kinds of great civilian initiatives. So with a lot of the young men being brought into the armed forces, people had to take their places. And of course, one famous place that, for instance, women took the place of men was in various industries. But also, when you think about it, things like the fire department and other emergency services, somebody had to do those things if young firemen were brought into the armed forces. And so in this picture, members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the Order of the Purple Heart were being trained to help the Sioux City Fire Department in case of emergency. So essentially, the older men that you see in the picture being trained are World War I veterans that were in those organizations being trained to help out. Of course, there were always parades. Parades were always a way to first off to raise money in bond drives, but also to keep up the morale on the home front. And because we had the huge air base here in Sioux City, there were always plenty of military personnel and equipment available to have a parade. And so here we have the Army Day Parade in April of 1942, and this picture's at 4th and Pierce Streets, kind of looking off to the northeast, and we have a troop of Boy Scouts carrying banners here in the foreground. same parade, just have different units like Veterans of Foreign Wars Color Guard. We have an ROTC group from USD, and then the Monaghan Post American Legion is bringing up the rear in this picture. So there are all kinds of different drives and things that went on, and scrap iron drives were a big one during the war. And of course, the scrap iron was actually used in the U.S. military effort, and there would be depots for collecting the scrap iron all over Sioux City. This one happens to be at 11th and Wall Streets, so just to the kind of northeast of downtown. So people would bring whatever they had that they could contribute to these scrap iron drives, or out on the farm. A lot of times, of course, every farmstead has a scrap iron pile, and a lot of times those things would go on these scrap iron drives. Sometimes really valuable things like, I believe Central High had a Civil War cannon on their grounds, and they contributed that to the war effort. Things like that oftentimes were turned over as well. Here we have a picture, speaking of Central High, a picture of Central High School students in 1942 doing an air raid drill. And as crazy as that may seem today, there were preparations made for that kind of thing. The big advantage the U.S. had during World War II was its isolation from the theaters of combat. And so unlike in Europe and in Asia, the U.S. public wasn't under constant attack from the enemy. It was secure that way, but there were different preparations, particularly on the coast, but even in Sioux City during the war to prepare for some kind of enemy attack. So you can see they're looks like they're under the stairs somewhere up at Central High. Here we have a picture of sugar rationing. So this is a crowd that's gathered at the Woodbury County Courthouse. And sugar was one of the big food items that was rationed. And oftentimes, it's great, the old ration cards. And there were all kinds of food items that were rationed during the war. And it was done to make sure there was enough food for the U.S. military personnel overseas. But I think a lot of the reasoning for the rationing was for the public to have to sacrifice for the war effort. Because in the end, the U.S. probably produced plenty of food to feed its troops during the war, but it was a way to contribute, and sugar rationing certainly was one of them. Here we have a picture. This is a great picture down at Stockyards Ballpark during a bond drive in the summer of 1942. So Stockyards Ballpark was the baseball stadium down at Dace Avenue and Steuben Street, right down the north end of the Stockyards district. And the comedians Bud Abbott and Lou Costello showed up to raise funds, and Sioux City residents contributed $125,000 in the bond drive. Hi, here we have a picture of a Labor Day parade in September of 1942. So this picture is taken we're looking east on 4th Street from Nebraska streets. And this was a U.S. Army unit from Kansas had come to participate in the parade. And this is the first time the Sioux City people had seen a Jeep, so a new form of military transportation during the war. And one of the ways that they raised money is that if you bought a certain amount of war stamps, you got a ride in a Jeep out at Riverside Park. So that was part of this event. Another thing that was rationed was tires, and of course the rubber this was actually something that was needed during the war, because when you think about it, natural rubber comes from Southeast Asia, which was largely under Japanese control during the war, and so rubber was something that was definitely conserved during the war time. And so this is a pile of tires that have been collected. It's on the Northwestern Railway warehouse at the corner of 2nd and Nebraska streets. And there were different things they did to conserve both rubber and fuel. For instance, during World War II, I believe the speed limit in Iowa was 35 miles an hour on most roads. So that was one way they were trying to save tires and fuel. Something that was an ongoing project throughout the war were the service flags, and they were started. So during the 1930s, as a New Deal project, there was what was called the Woodbury County Sewing Room in the courthouse that put unemployed seamstresses and such to work. And one of their projects during the war were these huge war flags, in which they had a blue star for each Woodbury County resident that was in U.S. military service, and then they also had a banner with gold stars for each that lost their lives in service. Here we have a picture. So this is the first Christmas while the U.S. was at war in December of 1942. So this is a big crowd at the Sioux City Post Office, which at that time was in the Federal Building at 6th and Douglas Streets. And so they're cramming in to get packages sent off to loved ones in military service, or to people that had been brought into war work in other parts of the country and things like that. Here we have a picture of Boy Scouts helping out with air raid training, and they're at 4th and Pearl Streets. They're helping firemen and civilian defense workers in this training activity. There were a few practice runs at having a blackout in Sioux City. So this was more common, particularly on the West Coast, where there was some threat of a Japanese attack along the West Coast. But Sioux City did try to do some blackout training, and the people of Sioux City were always getting scolded in the newspaper for not participating very well in these blackouts. But this is a picture on 4th Street. Looking west from Jackson, and so in the first picture, you see of course, 4th Street was the main business street, and see all the lights of the businesses and such, and then after the blackout had started with them all shut off. One of the ways that money would be raised on the bond drives was that they would bring in captured either Japanese or German military equipment, and to get a good look at it, you had to pay so much, and or buy so many defense bonds. And so in this case, it's a Japanese suicide submarine, and this is right outside the Capitol Theater, which was right in our block here along Nebraska Street between 4th and 5th Streets. And so you can see the crowd that had gathered to buy war stamps. So the first time that Sioux City residents got to go down and visit the Sioux City Army Air Base during the war was in August of 1944, when they had the 4th National Bond Sale here in Sioux City. And I believe they raised something like $2.5 million, something like that, in this, just from Sioux City residents. And so they're holding a banner that said that the money raised would buy 24 B-17 Flying Fortresses. And so they had a big barbecue and things down at the air base during this bond drive. And here we have a little reenactment that was done in the same event. So you have some U.S. Army Air Corps members dressed up like Adolf Hitler and Hideki Tojo, and of course Satan himself. And so putting on some kind of it looks like they raised $6 million. So quite a contribution. So there were various war industries in Sioux City that contributed to the U.S. military effort. A big one was the Sioux City stockyards, and the various meatpacking plants had contracts with the U.S. military. And so the war years were the busiest in terms of the volume of livestock traded at the Sioux City stockyards and processing at the local plants. And so here we have a picture. This picture was actually taken in 1946, the day that price controls that had been put in during the war were released. Probably the biggest war producer during the war was the Windcharger Corporation, owned by Zenith. And at that time, the Windcharger plant was over at 7th and Division Streets, where the Sioux City Foundry is today. So before the war, Zenith Windcharger produced, first off, wind generators, electric generators, but then they also produced components for Zenith radios. But during the war, they made a range of products, but the big one were what they called dynamotors that were used in U.S. Planes. And so they were an electric generating device that was used in the electronics in U.S. planes. And during the war, so if a war producer hit a certain production goal, the Army Navy had its E Award for excellence, and Wind Charger won that in 1943. And so here we have some dignitaries from the military that showed up to honor Wind Charger leaders and their employees at this event. Another big wartime producer in Sioux City was Sioux City Battery Company. So Sioux City Battery Company actually started during the war, and it went into the what had been the Simmons Hardware Company plant, which we've really known ever after as the Battery Building, of course the Hard Rock Casino today. And so Sioux City Battery was a division of Rayovac Batteries, and they produced batteries for the U.S. military during the war, and then continued to operate here in Sioux City into the 1950s, I think until about 1956 or so. Here we have a picture of Sioux City Battery employees outside of the building in the late 1940s. Another Sioux City producer for the military was Alf's Baker Manufacturing. Alf's Manufacturing produced clothing items for the U.S. military. At that time, Alf's was over in the Boston Block building at 4th and Virginia Streets on the northeast corner. So here's a picture of their sewing rooms in that building. Another, Rockland Manufacturing was a significant war producer. Of course, the Rockland Company, right down by the Arby's off of Virginia Streets and Gordon Drive. And Rockland Manufacturing was a kind of a small machinist shop, but produced different components for things like landing gear in the U.S. planes and things like that. Another one was Sherman Food Processing, which was at the northeast corner of 2nd and Iowa Street, and they produced food products for the U.S. military. Now, Sherman Food Processing was involved in a scandal during the war in which they produced some less than stellar products that the leaders of the company got in some trouble for later in the war. And then the U.S. Army Air Corps had all kinds of storage facilities around town that they used as warehouses. One of them was the warehouse building at 4th and Morgan Streets, where the Scandinavian societies used to be located. The old C.T. Hopper Furniture Building was another warehouse, which now is condominiums for the Ho-Chunk Corporation at 1st and Virginia Streets. And of course, another big war producer here in Sioux City was Albertson and Company, or Sioux Tools. And Albertson and Company made all kinds of tools and products for maintaining U.S. military equipment during the war. All kinds of kits and valve grinders and things like that. Here we have a picture of at the Northwestern Bell Telephone Company in August of 1945. So be just up the street at 9th and Douglas Streets, and of course the Warriors were very busy time at the telephone company with loved ones calling in when they could from other parts of the country or even from overseas. And so I believe when this picture was taken was right after the Japanese surrender in August of 1945, and so it was a particularly busy day. So finally, to finish up, the war gradually came to an end in 1945. In Europe, the Allies, so principally the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, stopped the German advance at Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, and gradually and eventually defeated the Germans in early 1943 and began pushing back, driving the German troops back to the west. At the same time, the U.S. landed troops in North Africa and eventually made their way up through Sicily and into Italy and became kind of bogged down there. And then in June of 1944, landed troops at Normandy along with the British and the Canadians, and really was then the big westward push in late 44, early 45 toward Germany. And so basically Germany was caught between a vice and surrendered in May of 1945. And so what was called VE Day in May of 1945, so Victory in Europe. Here's a parade that was held in Sioux City to celebrate the German surrender in Europe. And so this is a picture of nurses and female U.S. Army Air Corps personnel marching on 4th Street, and we're looking back toward Jennings Street. You can see the Badgero building in the distance in this photo. So we're kind of over by where the convention center is today. Same parade, only here we're at 4th and Pierce Streets, looking back to the west, and we have probably a National Guard group marching in the foreground. So in the Pacific, it took longer. So the U.S. troops, or U.S. Marines and the U.S. Navy, by early 1945, had taken the island of Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, so not very far from the Japanese mainland, and plans were being made during the summer of 1945 for an occupation of an invasion of the Japanese home islands. And of course, remember at this time, no one knew about the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb, and so there was no knowledge of that. And so the U.S. public was being prepared for this big final invasion of the Japanese home islands, which everyone was very concerned about. And ironically, one of the things that happened right before the dropping of the atomic bombs was the first B-29 Superfortress bombers came to Sioux City in August of 1945 as part of a bond rally. But there was a sense at that time that Sioux City was going to be used for training B-29 crews in the coming months. And the B-29 was the big long-range bomber that the U.S. developed during the war. It was the most expensive war project of World War II, more expensive than the Manhattan Project. And the B-29 was first used in June of 1944, and they were used for long-range bombing missions over the Japanese homeland, which ran through 1945 and through late 44 and throughout 1945, and eventually dropped the 2 atomic bombs, the first on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945 and the second on Nagasaki on the 9th of August. So this picture was taken on the 2nd of August. So, and you know, the public had no idea that was going to happen when this picture was taken. So the dropping of the bombs ended the war faster than what most had been prepared for. It was most believed that the war was going to go into 1946 and longer, and so it abruptly brought it to the end. The Japanese formally surrendered in September of 1945. And so here is a picture of a victory parade in October of 1945 here in Sioux City. And in this picture, we're on 4th Street at 4th and Pierce Street looking back to the east. And the Boy Scouts that you see here in the foreground are carrying the service flags. And those flags have almost 11,000 blue stars for all the Woodbury County residents that served in the war, and 351 gold stars for those that had lost their lives during the war. And I believe that in the end, the total number of Woodbury County dead was closer to about 400 when all was said and done, and over 11,000 served during the war. So a very big commitment. And of course, that was roughly probably average for the United States overall, just to get a sense of the participation in the war effort. And finally, one last photo of the same parade at 4th and Pierce with military personnel marching through the foreground. And so with that, you could see that World War II profound impact on, first off, the development of the Sioux City Airport and the military presence here in Sioux City. Definitely expanded Sioux City industry during the war, and of course profoundly impacted individual Sioux City residents who participate in things like the bond sales and the rationing, but also had loved ones that served in the war, and also some that lost their lives, and or had knew people that did. And so it was one of those big shared experiences that I think everybody that lived through it, it put something, something that lasted, and an impression that lasted throughout their lives, or has lasted.